the webinar very shortly. We're just letting people in from the waiting room, and I can see you all coming in. And people are still coming into the waiting room.
So it doesn't matter if I'm there or not, right?
You were just afraid they'd abandon you. So you abandoned them. You distanced yourself from the whole thing.
Still see people coming in. All right, why don't we get started? So good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Thank you so much for joining us for Business Over Breakfast this morning. As the COVID-19 pandemic fades, our attention is rightly focused on how do we pick up the pieces from this enormous disruption. But before we move ahead at full steam, you know, what have we learned? What steps can we already start to take for what everybody is saying will be another next major disruption? As we reinvent our companies, our communities, our societies, how should we anticipate and build in the resilience against other threats to our systems, whether or not they come from microbes, natural disasters, conflicts, or even outer space? Today, Emeritus Professor Patrick Noonan is back to help us make sense of these questions in a session entitled Risk and Resilience, Lessons for Next Time. As a reminder, Patrick Noonan is Professor Emeritus in the practice of Information Systems and Operations Management. His field is decision analysis, which draws on both the wisdom and the analytical methodologies of economics, psychology, statistics, sociology, and engineering to provide prescriptions for improving decision-making in business, in the professions, in healthcare, and in life. Patrick is going to kick off the webinar with some information and observations, followed by answering your questions, which you can put in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. If you want to dive deeper into this type of content and the approach that Patrick uses, there are a couple of chances that are coming up to continue learning with Patrick. One is Crafting Communication for Influence and Impact. That's a workshop that starts on March 18th. And then in May, the middle of May, May 18th, starts the Structured Problem Solving course that Patrick and Lynn Siegel teach. Both of those are in a live dynamic virtual mode. Before I hand it over to Patrick, I do want to remind everyone that this month starts the transition to a first and third cadence for Business Over Breakfast. So please mark your calendars for our next session, which will be on March 18th, and that is Communicating Your Change Vision with Molly Epstein. I also want to publicly thank everyone in the Emory Executive Education team and all of the faculty and speakers who have turned up each week and have put countless hours into bringing us such an interesting and informative and relevant mix of information to help us navigate the last 12 months. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Patrick, and over to you.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me and see me okay. I'm coming to you from Boone, North Carolina. We've taken the opportunity to delay spring by one more week and go up into the mountains. And it's a great opportunity to be here. Thanks to Emory Executive Education for this opportunity to come back and appear in the Business Over Breakfast series. You should be now seeing my shared screen, and those were the questions that Nicola teed up for us to think about here. We live in interesting times, but unfortunately, that's in the sense of the old Chinese curse about living in interesting times. We're coming out of a very long year. Interestingly, it was just a year ago that we had our first confirmed cases in the U.S. of non-travel driven COVID, and so it's just, I'm sure we're all going through the first anniversary thinking, oh, it was a year ago was the last time I did this, a year ago was the last time I did that. And we're starting to see some things changing. And as Nicholas said, we're rightly focused on this idea of how do we repair and rebuild our lives, our families, our organizations, and society from this major disruption. But let's take this opportunity to also think ahead. We've been given another reminder, multiple reminders along the way, and one quite recently, the deep freeze and storms in Texas, where we had the spectacle of some of our fellow Americans in the great state of Texas, no less, lining up to get food and water after basically, some winter happened. That also ties into what we should be thinking about and talking about today. How should we be thinking ahead and preparing ourselves at all levels for inevitable disruptions and disasters that will take place? So in order to get going and to make it interactive, the one thing I'd like just to start trying, some of you have done this before, is to fire up a browser, and you can do this on your phone as well, but any kind of browser window, go to menti.com, and it'll prompt you for a session code that will queue up the questions that we will be interacting over together today. So please go to menti.com in any browser window, phone or computer. And when you're prompted, today's code, as you see, is 71 57 00 and 9. And that will get you to our first question. Let me flip over to that. Some of you have already been entering that. You should be seeing our word cloud now of where people are located. Of course, Atlanta is in the center, but we have people from throughout the metro area and beyond. We have Indianapolis, we see Montreal, we see Gainesville, Florida, Chicago, and Nashville. And once again, Kuwait. I can imagine who that might be. A shout out to our friends in Kuwait. Some other people up in the mountains in Blue Ridge. Buenos Aires, Indian, and Rhode Island. Outstanding. Well, that's some good practice. We're going to use Menti a couple of times today to poll the group and to be able to see what people's points of view on a couple of questions are. And to that end, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to flip to the next question. So you'll now be prompted on Menti to answer the following question. And the question is, how big an impact has the COVID-19 pandemic had on you? And you can go from strongly disagree to strongly agree on several different dimensions. The first is, it's hit close to me, my friends, and my family. Is it strongly disagree to strongly agree? What about the second question? It significantly reduced my daily quality of life. Disagree to strongly agree. And then material harm to my company and my organization. And what you should be seeing there is the overall level of impact, where the greatest level of impact is scores to the right in agreement. And this has been a pretty consistent response. I've asked this question in a couple of different settings in recent months particularly, and we're seeing that this top number of hitting close to me, friends, and family has been going up and is often higher than the impact on companies and organizations, but still largely, a large agreement that there has been a significant impact. And if we tally, it's too early to really tally the total cost in terms of lives and economic toll and other changes, things that we've lost that we haven't quite even realized yet to our way of living. that has been a major impact. It's been a major disruption for us. And yet, we have more to think about. This will happen again, and it could have been worse. And that'll be the first point we'll get to today. Let me give you a little bit of background that beyond what Nicola gave in the introduction about why we're talking about this today and why I'm talking about this today. One of the ways I've been spending my isolation for the past year is finishing up some books. A couple of the books are directly related to my professional field. There's a book that I'm writing with my protege and co-author, Lynn Siegel, about structured problem solving, and that book's going to be called Don't Smash the Watermelon. That's the material on which we draw on some of the executive education offerings that you heard are coming up. I'm also revisiting a textbook that I wrote on my primary academic field, which is analytics, decision analysis, data analysis, and so forth, and revisiting this old manuscript and bringing it up to date. So I've been working on that, and that's been pretty productive. I've also been working on finally getting down to writing a novel that I had long planned. And actually, all three of these things come together in today's topic, as you will see as we go. Thinking about what happened, what just happened to us, what are we experiencing in business and society and our families, and what should we do about that? So the first point I want to make, and there's three major points that you'll see from me today. The first major point is this, is that as bad as it's been, we actually dodged a bullet because it could have been much worse. And that's not just a turn of a phrase. It's not just a manner of speaking. There are some very specific ways in which it could have been worse. And the other thing is that there's going to be other things that we're going to have to dodge going forward. So let's understand what we mean by that. And that sets the stage for an interesting set of problems for us to solve as individuals and organizations and societies. So the question really was, how surprising was this? How surprising was this pandemic? Just a year ago, it was the first time that many of us were focusing in on this particular threat. And dialing back to some business over breakfast talks that I gave last year early on, we were looking in June, mid-June, at the numbers, the number of confirmed cases, the number of deaths, and the way it was still rising rapidly. We were looking at a chart like this in June and trying to then project in July, well, what happened next? And we now know what happened next is that it turned up and got to what were then kind of astonishing numbers of 50,000 cases a day. We were astonished. We were shocked at that, many of us, at the extent of this pandemic when it broke out. But now, of course, from the perspective of a year later, we can put that chart into context as well and see what happened afterwards. Fortunately, we're back down to a place where we're at about 60,000 new cases a day in the U.S., but these numbers, including days close to 300,000 cases, for many people would have been absolutely astonishing. And I think most people a year ago would not have expected over 100 million cases globally and the impact that we've had. And yet at the same time, there were plenty of people who were at that very moment saying, yes, of course, we kind of knew something like this was going to happen. Almost like, and some of you were former students of mine who might remember our discussions about the Challenger disaster. When the Challenger exploded, there were a group of people whose reaction was not, oh my gosh, what happened? Was, well, we tried to warn you. And those people are going to their graves knowing that they failed in their ability to communicate something very, very important and to have people act about it. The curse of Cassandra. This is about to happen. It's a disaster. Nobody's listening. Pandemic is a fact of life, and it will be a fact of life for us in the decades ahead. And here's why. Because there's a concept called zoonotic spillover. And what that means is the transfer of microbes, so in this case viruses, from animal populations, what they call reservoirs of the virus, to human populations. Close contact of humans through wildlife or through livestock cause a zoonotic spillover, a zoonotic transfer. an animal-based disease jumps over to humans. It could be that it's the first time there's a contact, or it could be because of mutation. So this happens all the time. Most of the time, nothing breaks out. But we've seen in recent years, some of the early warnings were MERS and SARS, but also the annual influenzas. The reservoirs of these viruses are in ducks or in pigs and so forth. And then some sort of contact causes it to get into the human population. So this sort of stuff happens all the time. The other part of this that makes it pretty much inevitable is the way in which we travel now. This is a map that I dug out last year when we were talking about this, the pandemic during the summer, a map from 100 years ago. And this talks about, it's called isochronic distances. So it talks about how long it takes to get from London, in this case, to other places in the world. And everything within the dark red blob, you can get there within 5 days. The pink, 5 to 10 days. Notice what the scale, the time scale is. And there were some places where it would take over 40 days to get from London. Well, right now, we can get to almost anywhere in the world very, very quickly. And the point is also that millions of people do. The flow of people and goods throughout the world is so enormous and so fast. The World Bank estimated that 90% of the entire surface of the planet is now within reach of a large city within 48 hours. And so we crisscross the planet, interacting with each other. And we also, in some places, interact with these animal populations. Zoonotic spillover plus high intensity of travel means that these kinds of things are likely to happen again. And the worry that we should have is this, is that there's a bit of I'm not a geneticist, and so I try to understand this at a level that maybe I can transfer to others. It's sort of a mutational slot machine. It's like genetic characteristics that mutate and recombine lead to different kinds of characteristics of these microbes, of these viruses and bacteria that change the way in which they act. And in some cases, it changes in the ways that are beneficial to humans, and others they make them more dangerous. And so we should be thinking about, well, we drew this particular COVID-19 virus and its variants, but what if? What if it were different? What if it had played out slightly differently? We would have very, very different kind of conversation today. For example, what if the virus survived on surfaces for a matter of weeks? There are other kinds of microbes and microorganisms that can survive on surfaces. What if it was spread by surface contact and not by air droplets? Think about all the things that we've had to learn how to do and all the adaptations we've been able to make at great cost. But what if we had to do it differently? What if it was contagious but asymptomatic for weeks and not days? What if we had higher mortality or hospitalization rates? What if it were impossible to create a stable vaccine? It was not a foregone conclusion that it was vaccinable. What if it led to some kind of permanent disabling? In my youth, in my childhood, polio virus was still rampant and until the vaccines were there. And it caused people to lose the ability to breathe. They had to be in iron lungs. It caused disabilities in walking. So what if this virus actually had some different kinds of long-term effects than the ones that it actually does? What if it can hide? What if it could hide dormant inside our nervous system like other kinds of viruses? What if it differentially affected a certain population, not older people, but what if, for example, it differentially affected negatively women of childbearing age? There are so many other things that this could have been that we should not let our imaginations fail by indexing too much on the experience that we actually had. It could have been a little bit different. It's sort of like a small meteor hitting in a remote part of Wyoming. That should tell us that, wait a minute, there are other things that come from the sky. They can hit different places. They're of different sizes. What if? Would we be ready to respond to other kinds of scenarios? What would we do? The other complication, of course, is what we've learned is how interconnected our systems are. Many of the vulnerabilities and the costs that we've paid from this particular pandemic have come from the fact that systems are so interconnected, and that we've got global supply chains, for example, and that if one region of the world is shut down by pandemic, the ripples through our business happen almost immediately and are very difficult and time-consuming to repair. Lots of different things, systems are connected to other kinds of systems, whether there are health insurance systems, whether the way in which we do education, a lot of interconnectivity. These things are recipes for future disruptions. And rather than just go, oh my God, what are we going to do? Let's figure out and resolve to do some things. So let's go back to Menti again, and I'm going to tee up a new question. It's the same code, but you're going to get a different question when I advance the question. And it has to do with how well did we do. Let's give ourselves a little report card, and let's think about what sorts of things we might be able to do better. So here's the new question. Actually, before we get to that, let's talk about how close we are to the end. When will your life return to a close approximation of pre-pandemic? Thinking about socializing, shopping, school, travel, and so forth. Let's get people's prospects here. Hope we get some good news. Yes, we're getting some good news from the assembled group. Thank you. We asked this question last summer, and there were a lot of people who were thinking that it could be 6 months to 12 months, and there were others who were thinking it might be a couple of years. A year has now passed. I do think legitimately we are closer to the end than we are to the beginning. So we've still got a year of changes ahead of us where we are reevaluating what we do, thinking about, we've got some people still thinking 18 to 24 months and more than 2 years. I hope that's not the case. Okay, report card. How well did we do? And let's break it up from, failing grade to A+. Let's break it down to you yourselves and your immediate family. How well did you perform during the pandemic? How well did you do in responding and adapting to it? How well did your organization do? Could be your current organization, if you're in transition, your past organization. Think about your local community, and then let's think about at a national level, whatever your nation is. Most of the people here look like they're from the US, but there are some people representing some other countries as well. This is the pattern that I keep seeing, is that at an individual level, we feel like, okay, we were able to anticipate or respond pretty well, the highest grade. That's a pretty good one, a B, a solid B for ourselves, but then barely passing at the national level and going down from the organization, and then as we get to larger and larger communities. Yeah, so in some sense, we can respond pretty well in the smallest level, but overall, nobody's willing to give much of a passing grade to how, as a society, we performed in this situation. What sorts of things should we really have done better? Give you an opportunity to open, to type in some ideas. What are one or two things we really should have done better during this pandemic? We should start scrolling up some of your responses as we go. So we've already seen sacrifice having to do with testing, mandating masks and shutdown. There were some sort of attitudinal issues about taking it seriously and removing politics from it. Quick response, honesty, communication. Communication is a very common theme as well. The idea of a national strategy, as well as notice the comment of strong local leadership. Perhaps those are not mutually exclusive. Mask mandating, communications, educating based on empirical facts we see. And also we see another one about proper mask behavior. So again, a question of communication and education. Being proactive versus reactive is an interesting one, and that will be part of our theme here today. Consistency in communication, testing in all caps, 3 exclamation points. That was meant to be taken very seriously. We see a former student here saying, "Don't smash the watermelon." That's a reference to the kind of hasty messy decision-making that we often do, where we just smash the problem into pieces without stopping and thinking about how to do it well? Great. So we had lockdown earlier, we had no lockdown, government mandated protection, individual level actions. There's a lot of things that we could have done better. So let's be proactive here, and let's think about why were we surprised? What can we do better for next time? So again, the first point was it could have been worse. There are other threats ahead. Second point, there's a lot of advice out there. We keep not following it. So after every kind of disruption or disaster at whatever scale, there are experts who dig in and research what happened and what are the lessons and how can we avoid repeating that. So for example, the Challenger disaster, which was also ironically enough followed by the Columbia disaster not long after. There were a lot of lessons there about what happened, what went wrong, how could we avoid that. There was after 9/11 investigating what happened, what could we have done better to anticipate, prevent it, respond to it, and the post-war chaos that engulfed Iraq. Again, there's a lot of people took a lot of time to come up with what are the lessons for next time for these kinds of things. In the field of energy, we've got after 3 Mile Island, several commissions and books understanding what the problem was that took place there in the 70s. And then more recently, the tsunami that engulfed and flooded the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan, the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf, Hurricane Katrina, a lot of quarterbacking afterwards, the great blackout of 2003 in the Northeast where the grid collapsed there, and then most recently in Texas after the collapse of a lot of systems due to the winter storm. A lot of advice there. And in terms of the financial system and business, the collapse of Enron, I'm a big fan of the books of Michael Lewis, and he writes about a lot of interesting phenomena in ways that derive some lessons from these stories. There's no shortage of advice out there, and yet we seem to keep falling into a lot of the same traps. How do we avoid that, and why do we even fall into these traps? Well, we're talking about what are sometimes called black swans. A book by Nicholas Taleb called Black Swan is talking about the idea of things that are low probability but high impact. And people talk about, you can find black swan references all over the place. If you just Google black swans, you can see it used all the time. But we want to focus on what they're really about: low probability, high impact events. They live in what we might say the long tails of a probability distribution, and so that means they're hard to anticipate. These are things that have high impact but very low rate or very low probability of occurring at any given time or place, and so they're hard to anticipate. Exact locations and exact moments of these things may be almost impossible to predict, even though some of these things are actually inevitable given enough space and enough time. It's just whether something happens this particular moment. So think about the pandemic. Pandemic's inevitable. The COVID-19, that particular virus, a coronavirus coming out of a particular region of China and having particular characteristics at that particular time, there's really no way to say that that was going to happen at the time in the way that it did. But again, over a long enough period of time, a lot of things that are high impact are inevitable. If we take the history of the universe and project it out in the future, a lot of bad stuff is going to happen. The sun swells and dies, destroying the Earth. Oh, and the Andromeda Galaxy collides with our own Milky Way. But that's 5 billion years. And so, the sky now and the sky 5 billion years from now, oh no, we're doomed. Yeah, but that's kind of future generations, if we're there, are doomed. The time scale on these things matters. What should we be thinking about within the time scale of our lives, and our children's lives, and the scope of responsibility of our organizations. So there's some kind of sweet spot there, somewhere between, oh, there's going to be a little frost on my car, to the sun stops working and the earth freezes over. Somewhere between the inconsequential and extinction level events. So let's say starting at sort of snowmageddon level, 7 years ago in Atlanta, a collapse of systems that caused people to be sleeping in their cars, unable to move on the highway. Somewhere between there, the melting glaciers of climate change, there's some sweet spot in there where these are things that can happen in the course of our lives or our children's lives, and the kinds of things, and we can do something about them. We can't do anything about the sun cooling down eventually, but these are some things we can do something about. What should we do? Well, there are people that look at these and they try to make some predictions about what's going to happen at that level. So for example, one source you'll see a lot today, the World Economic Forum, their Global Risk Report. It's a free report. You can find it on the internet. New ones comes out every year. And they survey people to try to understand what kinds of things at a global level are likely to take place in the coming year and would have a very high impact if they took place in the coming year. And they've got them color-coded by different types of categories. Notice that in 2016, they recognized that the spread of infectious diseases, including pandemic, would be a pretty high impact kind of a thing, but it wasn't on the likelihood scale. Here's the 2018 report where they're using a 2x2, the likelihood across the horizontal axis and impact on the vertical axis. Spread of infectious disease is on there because it would be a pretty big impact event, but also in any given year, not that likely to break out, but it was on their radar. So should we have been anticipating this? In a sense, we should have, because it's the kind of thing that the impact is so great and it's inevitable. It may not be 2018, it may not be 2016. We probably should have been paying some attention to that. So what does it mean to pay attention to things that could disrupt us? Well, it's really obvious. You're smart people, you're professionals. You could create this list on your own. We got to think harder. We got to plan better. We have to improve our responsiveness when things start to happen. And then we have to build in some resilience to be able to recover after the fact. This is all pretty obvious stuff. We need to make it more specific, more actionable, and we need to actually do something about it. Let's take a look at some examples of the kind of advice that pops up along this line after past disasters. So for example, in 2001, a really good article by Zook and Rigby in the Harvard Management Update, talking about what happens after the dot-com bubble collapsed, and there was a collapse in some of the financial markets, and a lot of employment markets were disrupted. It was what we thought of until 2008 a pretty major economic disruption. And they wrote this article that said, well, you should build strategic contingency planning into your culture. And it talks about considering extreme scenarios. What happens if your demand or price collapses? What happens if you've got a global supply chain disruption? Well, that would have been good advice to take if we'd been listening, because if we'd been thinking about vulnerabilities to a global supply chain, thinking about collapse of demand and building some contingencies into that, we might have been prepared. Another one that they talked about was strengthening bonds of loyalty, a very cultural kind of approach, which is thinking about employees internally and thinking about vendors and thinking about the relationships that they have, and also about prioritization, about protecting core assets, making sure you're very clear about what are the core functions. It's like when the body is stressed with, if you fall into a very cold water, a frozen lake, and you get very cold and your body temperature goes down, your body undergoes some changes to try to protect core systems, the things that absolutely have to survive. So being able to think about, if you had a disruption, what sorts of things would you be willing to let go of in order to protect things that will keep you alive? Again, it's a lot of good advice, and having to do with clear expectations and honesty about planning and communicating to others. After Hurricane Katrina, One of my favorite articles along this line came from the editor of Fortune, Jeff Colvin. His brother is actually one of our Goizueta alums. I actually taught him game theory some years ago. And his sister, Sean Colvin's a great musician. But anyway, Jeff Colvin is the editor of Fortune, and he wrote this thing called 5 Ways Managers Can Use Scenario Planning. And he said, first of all, you got to turbocharge your imagination. Events that do the worst damage are the ones no one even conceived of. I mentioned this failure of imagination earlier, is that we have to imagine better. And it's very easy for us to fall into traps where our imagination is very narrow, where we're keying in on things that we've experienced before, and those aren't the things that really are going to get us. Build scenarios. Anticipate scenarios. And he also says that if we adopt this scenario mindset, that the scenarios that we anticipate, even if they don't happen, the process of generating them can be a valuable process. This builds a capability of imagination and responsiveness that builds capabilities for everyday kinds of activities. Think in probabilities. Recognize the difference between things that are 1 in a million, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10, and overcome some of the weaknesses that we have in thinking about events that are very low probability. He's a big fan of markets, of course, and also about culture. In this particular case, create a culture that insists on facing reality. We have a tendency to avoid reality, to minimize bad news, and that's a corporate culture kind of a thing. So that's some very good advice too, and so on and so on. A lot of great articles have been written after every past disaster about what to do, how do we prepare, how do we respond, how do we recover after the fact. So why are we surprised so often? And we are. Surprises take place far more often than we think they should. And yet, if we know that fact, we shouldn't be so surprised. It's a wonderful book. In thinking about this topic recently, I went back to a great book from 2004. It's by Max Bazerman and actually a PhD colleague of mine, Michael Watkins. It's a book called Predictable Surprises. And I think it's easily available, and it's an easy read with a lot of good case examples. I'd recommend you flipping through that. Let me summarize a couple of important points that Bazerman and Watkins make here. We're surprised really often. Really, there's 3 categories of things that get in the way: cognition, organization, and politics. The politics one, that's the easiest one to explain. Is that they're literally, it's politics. There are special interest groups whose reason for being is to lock in a particular status quo or prevent certain kinds of responses from taking place. I'm not going to talk about the politics of all that, but we have to recognize that there are some structural levels at society level having to do with politics that lock us into things that keep us from dealing with disruption. Let's talk about 2 that we can do something more about. One is cognition. In other words, there's some stuff that has to do with the way our brains work. And we tend to fool ourselves. We'll talk a little bit more about why that's the case, but we tend to discount the future too heavily. We should put a lot more weight on future events. We tend to be very biased toward the status quo, and we're locked into what we call anchoring on things that are more familiar to us. We often depend on what these authors call vivid data or personal experience. In other words, vivid data would be a disaster. Seeing a small series of near disasters is often not enough for us to go, if we do something now, maybe we don't get the big disaster. It often takes the big disaster. Or personal experience. Think about the number of people for whom this epidemic wasn't serious until it's happened to them or somebody in their family. So we've got some deep-seated individual biases that prevent us from responding. Why is that? Well, as humans, we evolved to survive and to be excellent problem solvers for very different kinds of problems. In a way, we had to learn how to solve problems like how to find food and how to not be found as food, and then how to function in society, like to be able to play well with others and to find mates and so forth. Those were the problems we needed to solve, and our human nature is very well suited to solve those problems very quickly and very robustly. But But the thing is that biologically, we're scarcely changed at all from our early Neolithic ancestors. And so we have kind of a Stone Age operating system. We're the same people biologically that built the Stonehenge, who also built the Perseverance rover and the Sky Crane that landed that car on Mars last week. Same species, and really the same thing going on in our brains. And so we have to recognize that we've got these fantastic capabilities, but at our core, we've got some things that got us to this day, but that might not serve us terribly well for the problems we're facing today. Now, some of these things are wired in, and so the yuck response is physiological. There's certain kinds of chemicals that taste bad to us, and that's part of our warning system. There's certain kinds of compounds that would be bad for us, and we can taste them. On the other hand, there's certain things that get right by that. We can't detect through our taste a lot of the dangers of heavy metals. There were no heavy metals in the early environment. There was really nothing to select on. Those are things that we have dug up from the crust in more modern times. We've learned some cultural defenses as well over the millennia as well. So, for example, some of the taboos about which hand you use to touch other people with and to touch food with, and certain kinds of food that may or may not be likely to be dangerous to eat. So we've built some cultural defenses, and we've also built the ability to build spacecraft. What does that mean? We've got this ability to make meta decisions. We can decide how to decide. We can create policies and procedures and structures, and we can try to shape our organizational cultures in ways that augment our Stone Age operating system and allow us to make better decisions. And that's what we need to tap into here to avoid falling into some of these cognitive traps. And they're pervasive. And in business, this is one that this is an experiment that we do all the time. And some of you may have done this in the classroom with me. Kind of a classic experimental result having to do with what we call overconfidence. So you ask people, predict what the price of, say, a Texas intermediate crude oil is going to be, in June of 2021, and you ask people for a point estimate, but you ask people to create an interval. In other words, you allow people to express the amount of uncertainty that they have about this by expressing if you're quite certain about what it's going to be, a very narrow interval. If you're not certain about it, very wide interval. And you ask people questions like this, and a very robust result that happens. It happens time and time again. People's intervals are too narrow. In other words, you let people say, well, what's a range that it could be? 90% chance it'll fall in what basket? What happens is that it falls outside of that basket almost half the time. And that means we're surprised quite often. And so we have this inability to fully imagine possibilities and extreme results. Things that we think of extreme are really not that extreme. And then at an organizational level, all the stuff that we know and that you've experienced, we've got gaps in individual knowledge, and we fail to really integrate that dispersed knowledge. We've got the expertise, all the pieces that we need throughout the organization, but we don't convene them and gather them. We don't, in any kind of formal way, collect and then disseminate information about the possible threats. And of course, some people are just bad actors, but mostly it's, there just aren't enough responsibilities and incentives to act in advance. One of the articles about Texas said, well, it was nobody's job to anticipate this. And that's true. So we have to think about anticipating, sharing information, capturing the lessons. It's very difficult to do after action reviews, where you say, what happened? What could we have done better? Not from a judgmental or an evaluative perspective, but from a developmental one. It's hard to do that. You have to have an organization with the ability to build trust and good communication, and the ability to build on the things and learn on and change their responses based on what they've learned. And
Patrick, a couple quick questions for you, if you don't mind.
Please.
So the first is,
sure. Let's hear from our group.
So the first question is, does social media exacerbate cognition issues by reinforcing communication bubbles? Yeah,
I think that's a good research question, and I will just state an opinion that's not based on research, just based on my own experience with social media, I think it is a huge problem, because it's very difficult to ascertain. Well, we get a lot of false positives and a lot of false negatives, right? There's so much noise in social media, and it's difficult to tell who's got actual firsthand experience, who's looking at the data, who's analyzing it correctly, and who's just expressing opinion based on limited experience, based on fear, based on motivation. So there's an awful lot of noise. And so we saw that in COVID. We've got this epidemic is starting within China. Getting the straight facts, they were in there, but also surrounded by bubbles of enormous amounts of noise. And I think a lot of us, our reaction is, I'm not going to take any action on anything severe because who knows what's true. At the same time, when things on social media are focused on things that motivate us at a very primal level, they get to that Stone Age operating system that get us to be afraid of something, they can motivate us to do all sorts of things that are not in our interest. So I'd say, yeah, I look forward to in the next few years as people are able to do research about social media, which is still a growing thing. And social media in the pandemic, I think we're going to get a lot of uncomfortable lessons about our behavior. So yeah, that's just my opinion, not based on the research, but just my hypothesis about what we're going to see.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And just one more question for you. How do you propose inculcating scenario planning into the body politic rather than stumble along in a haze of short-term gratification?
Right. Thank you. That's a great pivot question. And let me take our remaining time to talk a little bit about the kinds of things that we can do at different levels. There's some general lessons about what we should do. And then I've got some specific things that I've been thinking about that's actually based not solely on my work about organizational problem solving, but also as my new discoveries as a fiction writer. When I've got a fictional organization, I can manipulate them to do some things well and some things not so well. And I think some of the things that I've learned from using my imagination about this organization might be things that you can apply. So let's get prescriptive now. The last thing I wanted to mention here that is a factor here in this is there's another book from 1984 was the first edition, Normal Accidents by Charles Perrault, looking at how people explain away things that go badly, whether it's 3 Mile Island or other kinds of things. People tend to focus on, well, it was mechanical failure, it was human error, right? They do the blame game, and they hope that there's one thing that caused it. Or sometimes people just shrug and say, hey, stuff happens, yeah, a lot of things, it was a perfect storm kind of a thing. But what he's saying is that we have to be careful about what we call tightly coupled systems. So many of our organizational systems and interorganizational systems are networked and intercoupled systems. And if they're tightly coupled, trivial failures of a couple of components will bring down the entire thing. And that's much more common than we would be willing to admit. So again, we keep getting this advice, we keep not following it. How can we follow it? I hope you accept my premise now that there is going to be a next time of some sort, and pandemic is just one of those possible threads. That there are some things that we could do, but we have to set about doing them. Going back to Bazerman and Watkins, again, it's a really nice introduction to this topic, and I think they do a real clear job of giving us real-world political and business examples. They say, here's the stuff we need to do. Let's organize it by recognizing, prioritizing, and then mobilizing. And there are specific steps that they recommend that we can do at each of these stages. So in terms of recognizing, we have to recognize what risks are out there. And we have to redesign the kind of measurement systems. What do we actually measure that provide us some attention on potential problem areas? Establishing intelligence units. In other words, actually creating organizational units whose job it is to scan for these risks and to integrate the knowledge that people have. Structuring the processes for identifying the scenarios and educating the organizations about them. So again, it's structured processes. This meta decision. We're going to decide by having these units of people that convene. They have these responsibilities. We're going to measure some of these things. We're going to build ways to have communication channels within our organization. And then systems for institutional learning and knowledge preservation. People change their job, change companies, they change jobs, they move on. How do you build knowledge bases and expertise bases that are preserved? So the intelligence units and these communication processes should have some institutional memory to be able to not forget past lessons that were learned. In the middle, you have to prioritize. You can't act on everything and respond to everything. And so thinking about information sharing and a structured problem-solving process to evaluate kinds of options. We're prioritizing what sorts of things matter, what sorts of things give us lead time, give us some opportunities to do something about. And changing, so it's structured processes for problem solving and decision, but also incentive systems to make sure that people have an actual interest in pointing out and doing something about risk. People often say, look, pandemic, some sort of disruption in the supply chain, yeah, it's inevitable. It's unlikely to happen in the 2 years that I'm going to be in this job. If I spend money now or take some of my time now to take care of a threat, if it doesn't happen, that looks badly, right? That reflects badly on me. We've got to provide people incentives to do things that mitigate against risks, other than just their short-term performance. And then they also say mobilization. We have to be able to respond quickly, and we have to be able to commit resources in advance, and we need to be able to respond quickly when disruptions take place. We need to have organizations that communicate to each other, problem-solving groups that actually can quickly speak the same language, identify what threats and possible actions and alternatives, and conduct things when all of a sudden things get upended, as some of these things can happen very, very quickly. So when you go back and think about your report cards, go back and think about it further about how well did you do, individual, organization, society, on recognition, prioritization, and mobilization. Well, throughout these things, there are some common themes for action. So I've looked at a number of the literature about disasters and about disruption and about what do we do about it. And there are some common themes, because there's a lot of common sense here that's just common sense unacted upon. So some themes now, one is do something. Start now and continue. Build some way to get it to continue on a regular basis. Be careful of the bandwagons. Be careful of the complacent herds. Because when something happens, you don't want to be moving with the pack. It's a lesson I learned once in learning about fire safety with crowds, is that 90% of the people, if there's a fire alarm, 90% of the people go look for the entrance in which they entered a particular building or meeting room. And that's what causes deadly blockades at the entrance. So when you go into a new environment, you know where you came in. That's one possible avenue. Look for the other ones. You got to be able to spread out. Everybody tries to do the same thing and might not be survivable. So being intentional and being institutional. These methods are about trying to build in structures and routines and responsibilities, and don't just expect it to happen. So build all these organizational capabilities. And by the way, note that, and this is part of an answer to how do you make this happen, is you sell it on the fact that these are things that are going to help us do a better job solving problems and advancing our everyday non-disaster routine. In other words, if we had an organization that was thinking about different kinds of scenarios, those scenarios could have to do with pandemic, they could have to do with meteor strikes, they could have to do with solar storms, but they could also have to do with political unrest in the country of one of our key natural resources comes from, or it could come from, there's a new competitor in our market, and they've developed some intellectual property that has superior cost performance characteristics to our product. What do we do? Thinking about scenarios and the ability to scan the environment for threats, integrate knowledge, come up with good options, evaluate them, come up with action plans. What organization doesn't need that? The same kind of things you're doing, you can say, we're building our organization, we're building our team's ability to solve problems. And the way I would do it, I'm gonna stop here in a second, and so we can get some more questions. But you know, we can create some serious fun. And in my novel, they build a very diverse team. The research shows that the more diversity of cognitive styles, learning styles, life experiences, you can actually get higher quality solutions even faster, and that's some of the surprise in the research, than a more homogeneous team. Lunch and learns, that's the lunch bag up here. Bring in the experts. Don't just scan the environment for research reports. Bring in experts to interact with. It also allows you to have kind of a fun, social, interactive discussion about interesting issues, possibilities, and risks. And play a game. War game it. Come up with scenarios. Pull this problem-solving unit together and you say, boom, there's a new pandemic. Here's the twist. Here's the twist. It rides on surfaces, and it particularly likes to live on paper. Go. Throw people a new scenario where they have to play out what happens and solve problems in a short period of time in the event of a disruption. That kind of thing can make it very engaging, can build everyday capabilities, and also, we hope, we'll build some capabilities that come in handy if something else, some kind of unanticipated disruption takes place. Okay. Well, I've got more things we could talk about. Maybe we can talk in the future about solar flares, about the Cascadia subduction zone, about other kinds of threats that we actually face beyond pandemic. I think you should go and research some of these things yourselves. That's part of the point of this. But anyway, that's what we need to think about. We dodged a bullet. There's going to be more bullets, and there's a lot of advice out there that's unused. Let's set about now using that kind of advice to anticipate what might happen, to prioritize our responses, and to be ready to mobilize in the event of the future disruption. I'm going to turn it back over to my hosts now, Emory Executive Education. Thank them for the opportunity to chat with you about this. We'll take care of some questions, and I'll hang out after time. I know many of you will have to leave at this point, but let me hand it back over to my hosts, and thank you for your time this morning, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this topic.
Many thanks, Patrick, and thank you to all of you for your great questions. Sorry that we could not get to all of them this morning, but Patrick, thank you for the riveting and insightful presentation. Just a few quick things before we let you go for the rest of your Thursday. Please do join us not next Thursday, the following Thursday for Communicating Your Change Vision. As a reminder, we have changed our cadence of Business Over Breakfast from every Thursday to every first and third Thursday. And so for those of you who received many notifications and had some registration challenges, that is the result of us changing the cadence. And so we appreciate your patience and understanding. But again, do come back and join us on the 18th with Molly Epstein. Also, we do have some great upcoming programs and workshops, a couple of which Patrick will be teaching in. So we have coming up on March 18th, the communication workshop with Patrick and his colleague Lynn Siegel. So it's called Crafting Communication for Influence and Impact. We have negotiations and conflict management coming up later this month, as well as some other great ones. Just to draw your attention towards the bottom of the slide, we do have structured problem solving also coming up with Patrick, which will run in mid-May. So please do come to our website to learn more about these upcoming offerings. Again, we thank you so much for your time this morning. You will receive a quick poll survey that we ask that you would complete at the end of this. And thank you again, Patrick, for a really wonderful morning.